Welcome to Debate the News True Crime. I'm Joseph Labosco, joined by host Adrian Barker. Tonight, we delve into the terrifying case of Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper. In late August 1990, 5 college students were murdered in Gainesville, Florida, a spree that paralyzed a university town and later helped inspire the horror film Scream. A quick note before we begin, this episode includes descriptions of sexual violence and graphic crime scenes. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know needs support, help may be available via the Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. Adrian and I are not attorneys, law enforcement officers, or medical professionals. We research each case thoroughly, but this show is recorded live with minimal editing. Any factual inaccuracies are unintentional. And any individuals or entities mentioned who have not been convicted of a crime are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. The opinions of our guests and audience members are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself, Adrian, or Debate the News. As always, we approach this case with respect for all victims. May they rest in peace.
I'm Adrian Barker, and tonight we'll walk through the Gainesville Ripper murders, how the killer was unmasked, and how this nightmare seeped into pop culture. This is Debate the News True Crime. Let's dive into the timeline.
Late August 1990 in Gainesville, Florida felt like a fresh start. Parents idled at the curb, new roommates figured out who took which drawer, and the University of Florida stirred back to life. That sense of normalcy ended before the first week of classes. In the pre-dawn hours of August 24th, an intruder entered an off-campus apartment shared by freshmen Sonja Larson, 18, and Christina Powell, 17. When officers arrived later that day, they found both young women had been stabbed, one had been sexually assaulted.
The next night, Christa Hoyt, 18, a Santa Fe community college student who worked part-time in the sheriff records unit, failed to show for her shift. Deputies went to check on her. Christa had been murdered and decapitated.
Just after midnight on August 27th, the killer struck again at a ground floor apartment shared by Tracy Paules, 23, and her close friend Manuel Manny Taboada, 23. Manny woke, confronted the intruder, and fought so hard that neighbors heard the struggle through the wall. He was overpowered and stabbed to death. The killer then raped and murdered Tracy. Gainesville now had 5 murdered students in roughly 72 hours.
The public reaction was immediate and intense. Students left in convoys. Those who stayed pushed furniture against doors. They slept in groups. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Ammunition disappeared from the shelves. The university altered schedules and urged caution. Gainesville, ordinarily informal and friendly, moved through those days like a city under curfew.
Investigators from multiple agencies formed a task force and worked around the clock. They compared the 3 crime scenes and found the same core elements: a large knife, evidence of restraint, provocative posing, and an attempt to clean the victims. The forced entry points suggest a prying tool. All signs pointed to one offender with a precise method. Under extraordinary pressure and national attention, detectives focused early on Edward Humphrey, an 18-year-old freshman with visible facial scars who lived near one of the scenes. He was arrested on an unrelated domestic violence incident and held on a high bond while his photo was splashed across headlines. However, forensics did not support the theory. His blood type did not match, and he was later quietly ruled out. Gainesville was still looking for their killer.
It turned out the killer's hiding place was close by, but easy to miss. A woodland campsite sat behind palmettos and scrub with a tarp and a few supplies. On the same day Christa Hoyt was found, a bank near one of the murder scenes was robbed. The thief fled into the trees as a dye pack exploded in his cash bag. Later that evening, an officer discovered a stash at the forest campsite. Red-stained money was in there, a screwdriver capable of forcing doors, a handgun, and a cassette player with a tape inside. Investigators logged the items as robbery evidence. No one yet realized that the trail from the woods could lead back to the apartments.
10 days after the last murders, a Winn-Dixie supermarket 40 miles south was robbed. The getaway ended in a crash and an arrest. The suspect was Danny Rolling, a 36-year-old drifter from Louisiana who had been living on the edges of Gainesville that summer. There was no announcement of a connection to the student murders, and the killings had already stopped.
Weeks passed, and detectives kept sifting through evidence. Someone eventually retrieved the box of items from the Forest campsite, and they pressed play on the cassette. A man's voice filled the room. He spoke about a troubled life and then sang in a low folk cadence about being a drifter and a killer. And between verses, he said his own name, Danny Rolling. And the task force stopped and they listened again. And when investigators compared biological evidence from the murder scenes to Rolling, the signs pointed the same direction as the tape. The prying tool and the other items from the campsite aligned with the method of entry and the control at the apartments. Rolling's movements placed him in the area when the murders occurred. Gainesville's Phantom finally had a name.
By November 1991, prosecutors had charged Danny Rollings with the 5 student murders. Only after he was identified did the earlier shadows become clear. In May 1990, months before Gainesville, Rolling had shot his father during a violent confrontation in Louisiana and fled. Detectives also compared notes with Shreveport on an unsolved 1989 triple homicide of Tom Grissom, his daughter Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean. The staging and partial cleaning at that scene looked disturbingly familiar. A Shreveport acquaintance, Cindy Juricic, had already contacted authorities to say that Rolling was the first name that occurred to her when the Gainesville details made the news. Once Rolling's identity was known, those prior crimes snapped into place.
In February of 1994, on the eve of jury selection, Rolling pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder. He told the court, "There are some things you just can't run from." And when the plea entered, the proceedings shifted immediately to punishment. The defense presented evidence of a violently abusive childhood and raised Rolling's claims of dissociation, including an alternate persona he called Gemini, a name taken from a film. State experts testified that the crimes reflected planning and control, stalking, restraints, posing, washing, and other steps to conceal evidence. The jury recommended death, and the judge imposed that sentence.
The appeals process lasted more than a decade. On October 25, 2006, at Florida State Prison, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection. Witnesses reported that he sang a gospel refrain as the chemicals took hold. Shortly before his death, he provided a written confession to the Shreveport murders, formally closing that case. In total, 8 people had been killed by his hand, and many more had lived with the fear and grief that followed.
The town resumed daily life, but it did not return to the kind of innocence that existed on August 23rd.
The case also left a mark far beyond Florida. In 1994, a struggling screenwriter named Kevin Williamson was alone in a house channel surfing when he came across an ABC News documentary about the Gainesville Ripper. He became completely engrossed and terrified. At one point, Williamson realized a window in the house was open, and, in a moment of panic, he grabbed a kitchen knife and phoned a friend for comfort. This intense experience sparked a burst of creative inspiration. In a mere 3 days, Williamson banged out a screenplay originally titled Scary Movie, a self-aware slasher flick about a knife-wielding killer stalking teenagers. That script, of course, became Scream, the 1996 horror film that revitalized the slasher genre. Williamson has credited the Rollings case as a key influence. The idea that a real murderer was watching and hunting college students in their own homes was the seed for Scream's central premise. In fact, one of Scream's most iconic scenes, the opening sequence of the original film with Drew Barrymore's character, was directly inspired by Rollings' modus operandi of spying on victims and attacking them at night. It's a chilling instance of life-inspiring art. Scream's Ghostface Killer is not a retelling of Danny Rolling's crimes by any means, but the shadow of the Gainesville Ripper looms behind the fiction. Additionally, Rolling's case has since been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and even paranormal investigation shows. A lasting, if unsettling, legacy of a crime spree that blurred the lines between reality and a horror film.
There is a stark difference in how story functioned for the killer and the writer. Rowling tried to borrow from a movie, The Exorcist 3, to frame an alibi for an alternate persona he called Gemini. Williamson borrowed from real fear to create commentary that re-energized a genre and made audience think about complacency and safety. One man used fiction to evade responsibility, and the other used fiction to examine reality.
What endures is not the killer's staging, but the community's insistence that the final narrative belonged to the victims. The 5 students at the center of this case were more than the worst thing that happened to them. 2 were freshmen at the beginning of everything. 1 was a dependable young woman who showed up for every shift. 2 were longtime friends who trusted each other completely. And 1 died fighting to protect the other. Gainesville remembers them that way. That is the part of the story the killer never controlled, then or now.
The case still sparks major conversation 30 years plus later. So, our first question to all of you, we are live on Chatter Social. How did Danny Rolling manage to terrorize an entire town for 4 days without being caught?
You know, it's very interesting, Adrian, because now we know that the killer the whole time was camped out very close to the campus in basically a tent. Obviously, if there's a homeless person camped out in the woods that you know or suspect has committed a robbery, and you have 5 student murders in your vicinity, it would make sense to maybe be like, is this connected?
Why didn't they just take their thumb and press play on the cassette tape?
Exactly, Adrian. I think that probably would have solved this case a lot sooner had they just pressed play on that recorder.
What I don't understand is Christa Hoyt, 18 years old, works part-time in the sheriff's record unit. She fails to show up. I love that the deputies went to check on her. They find her. They encounter the horrible cruelty. I don't understand why they literally didn't drop every single thing to capture her murderer.
The impression that I get is this town was really shocked by these crimes. And when you have not just one murder, but 5 murders in a college town that's usually quiet, and they are as brutal as these crimes, like to find a victim decapitated with their bodies posed, that is not a typical homicide. So I think that this police force might have just been so overwhelmed that they just didn't know what to do.
4 days of a town being terrorized, that 4 days probably felt like 4 years.
Yeah, I think another reason why maybe they didn't catch the killer as quickly as they could have is they focused on this individual, Edward Humphrey, as a suspect. He had a history of mental illness, he was kind of erratic, so they held him on a domestic violence charge, and for a while he was largely their suspect. It even went to the extent that the press was releasing his name, his picture was in the paper, so for a while a lot of people thought that this was their guy. This was in the early 1990s. How would that type of a situation play out differently now in the age of social media? I imagine his name would be plastered all over Twitter and TikTok.
Oh, they would have dug up everything about him. They would have dug up every photo, anything he said, any meme that he put out, and we would have already heard how guilty he was. And that is the scary part of social media and true crime.
I think it may have been more difficult to convince the public that Danny Rolling was in fact the real killer when a suspect is splashed across social media or when the real culprit isn't immediately known, people do their own research and they kind of get in these corners where they come up with their own theories and they stick with them. By the time Danny Rolling's name came out, I think there'd be a lot of people stubbornly trying to still say, no, it's Edward Humphrey. I'm sure that still happened back then, but I think that would be more widespread nowadays.
So interesting. I think today law enforcement usually has someone on the case just to handle the true crime citizen journalists. Everyone's going to call, oh, Edward was this. I went to school with him, right? You've got all the citizen journalists that want to share the story, telling false narratives and not knowing the truth, but wanting to get views. So they're sharing information that's not correct. The police have to wade through all of that. I actually think, Joseph, that playing out in today's world with social media would actually cost them a lot more money. I think that this is a situation that probably will be discussed more, social media and the influence of it in murder and true crime cases.
Yeah, I agree, Adrian. And that brings us to our next discussion question, which is the cultural impact of this case. This case directly inspired the hit movie Scream, which is a major motion picture franchise. They're coming out with their 7th film. So, how do we feel about horrific real events like the Gainesville Ripper being turned into entertainment? Does that desensitize us as viewers? How do we feel about that?
Yeah, it's kinda crazy because I was thinking about it. Like, does it desensitize? What's our view whenever they turn these true crime stories into movies? And I'm kind of on the fence still. It's fun to be entertained because I saw the Scream movies and, yeah, it was terrifying, and The Mask was terrifying. But for me, it's actually kind of made me more aware of things because I didn't know that this was true. It doesn't desensitize me at all. It just makes me more aware, like, oh, I probably should lock my doors. Or if I'm leaving work at night and I'm in the parking lot, maybe I should turn around, and make sure that no one's following me. So I don't know. I don't want to say that it's necessarily a bad thing, but I do kind of have concern for like the families, and how they might feel. So I don't know. I'm on the fence, but I mean, for me, I can say that I'm definitely more aware of my surroundings, and I know all these things can happen.
So yeah, I'm a big Scream movie fan, and Kevin Williamson, the writer of Scream, has spoken about this in interviews, but just as a Scream fan, I can see some parallels that even he didn't mention. Like, for example, spoiler alert, Drew Barrymore's character is killed along with her boyfriend in the opening scene. Her boyfriend is a football player. That boyfriend's character very much matches the description of Manny Taboada in the opening scene of Scream. He's bound to a chair and tied up with tape. That seems right out of this case because Daniel Rawlings was known for using tape. But then throughout the rest of the Scream movie, you don't really see those themes. So I think writers and creatives are always going to take bits and pieces of truth to come up with their ideas. And I think that's just inevitable. So to me, it really doesn't bother me. I think it's kind of unavoidable.
Good points. Good points. I love that, Joseph. Tell us a little bit about Danny Rawlings.
Yeah, so Danny Rawlings was a really twisted person. He grew up in an abusive household, which obviously is out of his control. How the story is told is to escape his abusive household as a child, he would leave and go and walk the neighborhood to try to get away from his abusive father. And in doing so, he gained a habit of looking into the windows of other people in the neighborhood. And psychologists hypothesized that in doing that, he was looking into the windows of seemingly normal homes, seeing normal, happy families sitting around the dinner table, playing, etc., etc. And after a while, he grew resentment because that is not what his home life was like. As he grew older, that habit of looking into people's windows became much creepier and more sinister. And he started stalking people. And eventually that developed into a full blown homicidal rage, where, as we see in these cases in Gainesville, he actually entered the homes of many of these women and raped and killed them. So he had a very difficult life and childhood, but as an adult, that manifested into something that was obviously sinister and crazy.
Thank you, Joseph, for that information. That really is fascinating.
We have touched in a lot of cases where people who are killers and abusers and commit so many things are being abused by their parents when they were growing up. And they had a horrible childhood. This is something that I have been really meditating on. It's like, what made these people go and do that? And I feel like it is genetics. Like, he had the genes of being this person. He even said he had like double personality. He talked about having two names, and one was like soft and nice, and the other one was like the one that was committing these crimes. But in my opinion, there are so many people that have been abused and they don't become killers.
This is still a big question that experts don't necessarily agree upon. What are the ingredients that makes a Danny rolling? Is it just the abuse, or is it a combination of other factors? I think Danny Rolling was a sick individual in general, and then the abuse and a lot of other life circumstances were layered on top of that.
This Halloween, if I see a Scream mask, I'm going to say, take that mask off your face. I don't like that mask. Out of all the masks, that's the only one. I do not want to cross paths with you unless you do give me a nice basket of Tootsie Rolls.
I think if someone is wearing a Scream mask, I think you have a 1 week window. If you're within a week of Halloween, go for it. That's fine and normal. But if you go around walking the streets with a Scream mask on or any creepy Halloween mask on outside of a week window of Halloween, that's not good. That's asking for trouble.
I think it's time to conclude tonight's episode of Debate the News True Crime. So the Gainesville Ripper case shows how quickly a community's sense of safety can vanish and how long it takes to rebuild. And we remember Sonja Larson, Christina Powell, Christa Hoyt, Tracy Paules, and Manny Taboada.
The murders changed Gainesville and echoed far beyond it, even into the stories we tell on screen. Thank you for joining us tonight in Debate the News True Crime. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep these conversations going. We'll be back every Tuesday and Thursday with another case to dissect and debate. Until then, stay safe and take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.